Good evening tonight. It's my pleasure to welcome Sarah Zapata to the MFA Fine Arts Department at the School of Visual Arts. When Isabel suggested that we invite Sarah Zapata to come speak, the name rang a bell, but I wasn't immediately coming up with, remembering her work. And so then I Googled and quickly realized that I had seen it. In fact, it's a piece called To Teach or to Assume Authority that was shown at the Elizabeth Foundation, the EFA project space on 38th Street up in the Garment District in 2019. It was an amazing exhibition, curated group show called Curriculum, Spaces of Learning and Unlearning. And you know how sometimes you see a work in a group show and it really sticks with you? This work really stuck with me over the years, made a really strong impression. About this work, the curators wrote, Zapata's woolen landscapes propose a new kind of monumentality for our present moment, one that engages multiple senses and is indebted to indigenous histories. Much better said than I could. So Sarah is an artist and a writer who lives in Brooklyn and was born on the Gulf Coast of Texas, Corpus Christi. She's had a bunch of solo shows for an artist of her age, including one at the Kohler Art Center in Wisconsin. By the way, that's the proper pronunciation. It's not Wisconsin, it's Wisconsin. At least if you're from Wisconsin. PS 122, I'm sorry, no, Performance Space New York, here in New York, Deli Gallery in Long Island City, El Museo del Barrio, uptown, and Institute 193 in Lexington, Kentucky. And things are going well if you can list upcoming or forthcoming exhibitions running out to 2025 on your CV, including a show at the Arizona State University Museum in Tempe, Arizona in 2025. One at the Luminary in St. Louis in 2024. And another solo show coming up at Deli Gallery in Long Island City, New York, later this year. It's open now. It's open now. Let's go see it. So group shows at the Stedelijk Museum in the Netherlands, at Museo del Arte de Lima in Peru, at the new Museum of Contemporary Art over on the Bowery, the Museum of Art and Design here in New York, the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art in New York, Boston University, Lax Art in Los Angeles, Paul Kazman Gallery here in New York, Arsenal Contemporary here in the city, and of course, EFA Project Space. She's done residencies at the Museum of Arts and Design, at AZ West, at Wave Hill up in the Bronx, and the International Studio and Curatorial Program, which was a very selective honor that she received. Grant support for her work from the National Association of Latino Arts and Cultures, the Foundation for Contemporary Arts, that one's incredibly selective, and the Dallas Museum of Art. Got her BFA in fibers from what I think is the best art school in Texas, but some people would, might say that UT gives it a good run for the money. This is UNT, University of North Texas in Denton, which is north of Dallas. Is that right? Yeah. So please join me in giving a really warm welcome to Sarah Zapata.
Good evening. Thank you so much for that introduction. So great to see you all and to talk to you about my work. So we're gonna start at the beginning. I'm going to show some nasty student work I think it's important really to think about the trajectory and see the congruencies that existed when I was first starting making work and how that led to where I'm at today. So as Mark stated, I studied fibers at the University of North Texas. So I was really interested in weaving. Weaving is something that felt very important to me. My father is from Peru. I'm a first-generation American. And my mother is a Texan Evangelical Christian. And so working with your hands kind of felt like a way to sort of mediate these two contrasting but important identities that I occupied. So I was really interested in weaving itself. These are just hand-dyed works with supplemental yarn as well. And then my last year, I really got interested in telephone books. They really were this way to think about something that was obsolete, which obviously weaving in itself is so archaic. But to think about an object that was mass produced still at this time, but was also becoming very obsolete and not used anymore, but still very abundant. So the symbolism and poetic nature of it was appealing, but also thinking about it as this free, endless material and how that could be continued to manipulate it in a number of different ways. So I was thinking about how the books themselves could continue to be books, how the pages could be ripped and painted. And then I would take the pages and cut them into strips and then lay them into the warp and basically make paper textiles. And then from there, stretch them. And then thinking about these very architectural pieces and how they can, I guess, be this narrative of existing in the bounds, and then they're slowly evaporating, as well as eventually going deeply into detritus. And so thinking about how, again, this like very specific material is testament to the land, to time, to trash also as well. And so this work was actually these little pieces of paper that I would hand rip and then glue together and then put plaster and resin over it. In Texas, space is such, it's endless. And so really you could be as toxic and as large as you wanted. And so I really took advantage of using all of these elements that were there. So I really got into resin and using a lot of like AutoZone materials and how they could be turned into something more like bodily. And then the paper was then deconstructed and then turned into paper itself. And at this time, I think you can tell I was very scared to use color. Color felt like something that was too specific. And I was very interested in being like tasteful. I think I was very scared of the work being too crafty. And so for the colors to be much more muted, it felt like this like safe existence. So after I graduated in 2011, I moved to New York and I was convinced that I was going to be a telephone book artist. I fully came to New York with telephone books in my suitcases. Like I was convinced. I started collecting them. Again, they were still being produced even in New York at this time. And thankfully, I had received a grant from the Dallas Museum of Art to buy my first loom. And so grants are something that have been punctuated through my life, and that I am a very big proponent for getting grants, getting things to be paid for. And I think it's also a really important skill of learning how to write about your work in a way that makes sense for the project. And so that was something that I was nervous about. Being an artist and getting that grant felt like a nudge in the direction that I needed to. So this is back to working with this telephone book paper, weaving it on this little loom that I had. And then here's the next one. I basically unraveled all of this like cord to create these like bodily structures. really trying to make the most of the limited means that I had. So like finding little frames and how even just hanging it on an angle could make it seem much more intentional. But as you can see, just very confused. I really did not know how to really move forward and make work outside of school. When I moved to New York, I was fortunate enough to meet a lot of artists really out the gate, but everyone was making like very precious sculpture with trash. And so I thought that's what I should be doing. I should be making these like very precious things with like everyday objects, and how that can be this strange sort of like preciousness to these everyday objects. So this was like blinds that I had found on the street and then took apart, restrung, and then glued them on top, and then made more paper, again, painted them and dyed it. But really, eventually, I got to this place where rather than trying to make work that everyone else was making, I got to this point where it was like, honestly, this is the only perspective I have. I might as well just work with it and see how it goes. I was almost like embarrassed that I was working with textiles. I didn't know anyone at the time who was working with textiles. So it really felt like this like crafty, like shameful thing. But eventually I was able to understand that I could still be weird and still be myself and continue to push the medium. So this piece I feel like is very important. It's still paper, but there's all of this thread that I had been given. I was interning for these artists that were in Williamsburg. They were immensely helpful in just encouraging me, but also just seeing that it's possible. I feel like that was very, very helpful to see someone with their studio in their work. And also they made like very meticulous work at the same time. So it was a way that I felt like I could give my permission to be obsessive and to use this like same mechanical means over and over. And so at this time, I was also really interested in feet. And I'm sure you've experienced that when you first come to New York, your feet are just so beat up. You're walking all the time. And my feet were just a part of my body that I was thinking about a lot. And living in New York, it was the first time I was living as like an out lesbian for the first time, coming from a very conservative family in Texas. And so writing was a way that I was really able to navigate where I had been and digest what this like very Christian life had been. So in the Bible, feet are talked about often as your relationship to God, your trajectory through life. But they're also this like very important part of our body from an evolutionary standpoint. And so it felt like this part of the body that really straddled a lot of these ideas that I wanted to work with. So this work was obviously this giant foot. This was, I think, the first group show that I was in. Some friends organized it. They were art handlers, and they had really wanted to have the zip line that went through the space, since they would always see works in transit. And so what was it like if the viewers always saw the work in transit? So the work would just literally like shoot through the space coming down, but it was like this exciting, dynamic way to think about taking up space. And from there, I was really interested again in thinking about feet and how they could relate to textiles. Textiles are so related to the body. It's impossible to divorce the body from textiles. So rather than trying to liberate that idea, I was thinking, how about I control where it does relate? And so that for me was feet. So I had always wanted to make sculpture. And so I was just doing this coiling technique, which is a very traditional basketry technique. You can create very structural forms. In that traditionally it was a technique used to create vessels that held water. And so thinking about the female body as a vessel, but also this is a very simple technique that literally just takes rope, yarn, and a needle and can create very interesting structures. And from there, I had gotten my first studio. It was a teeny little closet, basically. And I had made my first rug. This is the first shag rug that I had made. It was initially this installation for Bushwick Open Studios, which at the time was this very beginning of that event. And so I wanted to film people's feet and how when they came into the space, they had to take off their socks and shoes, and how that would maybe make people uncomfortable or turned on. But regardless, it was this ceremonious coming into the space and then filming their feet on these paper sculptures, and then taking that footage and turning it into a foot erotica. So thinking about basically like how we are always consuming these technologies and we have very little control of like what happens to that. And so that was a really important learning experience. And going back to sculpture, and this is the same technique, but this sculpture is about 4 feet tall. And so this is, again, that coiling technique. But again, I'm starting to like get interested in color. And I think that at this time, I was just certain that I could just like mess it all up and that was okay. So it was like, I think sometimes I felt like I needed to give myself permission to accept like the inherent tackiness that exists within acrylic yarn and work with that, and how that can be tacky, it can be ugly and beautiful and cheap at the same time. And so here's another one from this group show, again, a paper sculpture. I really just could not get away from it, which is so funny to see now that it really lasted a lot longer than I thought it would. But so the Bushwick Open Studios, I was fortunate enough to get like my first little piece of press. And from there, the curator from El Museo del Barrio, she contacted me to see, she wanted to meet with me, and it was my first proper studio visit. And from there, it was a relationship that nothing had really materialized, honestly, until a year later, which is a very important learning experience in that everything is not so instantaneous and everyone's looking at your work, and sometimes you don't even know like what's happening. And so she had asked me to do my first show at El Museo, and it was this large scale work that I had wanted to do. This is 6 by 10 feet. This work is called Siempre X. And so this was made after I had spent 2 months in Peru. I was there visiting family, they're working on textiles, and I had really loved these pieces called arpilleras. And arpilleras are these really incredible narrative quilted pieces that are made in Peru and Chile. And a lot of times they were used to express like human rights abuses that were happening in Chile during the guerrilla occupation, as well as in Peru as well, with disappeared persons. And so what I loved about them was that they were something that was so political and narrative based, but still in this like very attainable structure. And so I wanted to make my own version of an arpillera, or a wall piece that was based off of that. And so a lot of these are hand-woven textiles that are cut and then sewn and added to these pieces. And all of this latch hook was done by hand, which again, this was a very important learning experience that is not possible. So after that show opened, I was a resident at the Museum of Arts and Design, and I had been asked to do my first or an installation for New York Textile Month at Mary Mecco, which is a store that was on 6th Avenue. And so this was my first sort of like rendering of what I had wanted to do, still wanting to make sculpture, but how these like rug forms can really take over the space and become like very excessive. And so this is what the work resulted in. Again, it was a very important learning experience, and thinking about how these rug sculptures can really be sculptural, how they can be immersive and just take up as much space as possible. And really using these like very feminine sort of items. There's hair, there's bra cups, and the color is just obviously all over the place. So from that, this is my first solo show at Delhi Gallery. This was in 2017. And so I wanted to, this was my first gallery solo show. So I knew that I did not want to use the wall. I felt like I wanted to use the floor. That is the most humble space in my opinion at the time. And very much my work, I'm very interested in how these means of labors can speak to humility rather than excess, and rather than being like masturbatory, like, look what I can do. And so for this show, it was called If I Could, which obviously is speaking to humility. But it's also the name of a song by Simon and Garfunkel that samples El Condor Pasa, which is an Andean folk song. So I felt like it was this perfect mix of American and Peruvianness, but also speaking to this idea of humility. And so for people to come into the space, they had to remove their socks and shoes, again, as like a ceremonial getting into the space. And I wanted people to come in and spend time with the sculptures. So the sculptures are actually the size of a seated body to create this idea of being with these works. And so these sculptures are based on the Paracas mummy bundles, which was this burial practice that was in pre-Columbian Peru, where the civilization would take bodies and put them into the natal position to create this idea of leaving and entering the world in the same way, place the body in a basket, and then basically create a womb with textiles. So very similarly, these had a basket base and then were covered in textiles. And on the interior of them, as a non-unseen element, there are these crosses that are made of steel, and they're bent crosses. They're curved and they're bent. And so in biblical text, it talks about how a curved cross is the mark of the beast in Revelation. The Antichrist will show up to the end of the world with a curved cross staff. But there's also this interpretation that a curved cross represents the humility of Christ. And so I felt like that was something that represented the sort of life force and spoke back to this idea of humility. From there, I was invited to the Museum of Arts and Design again to take place in a residency, this time that was in the gallery floor. So I shared my studio with LJ Roberts. We were on the 4th floor gallery. And so we were basically tasked to make this work while people were watching us, which was very bizarre. But it was a really important learning experience in that I had really wanted to make ruins. So this was the first time that I was really experimenting with how textiles could have these bases underneath and then basically have all these textiles layered upon them. Initially, I had really wanted to create just tons and tons and tons of textiles and create these layers that were over these pieces. But eventually, I think my mortality always catches up with me when I'm planning. And so basically, this was an interesting experience in that people were able to see work that was not done. And so coming from where I was controlling everything, suddenly everything was out of my control. And so it was a way to really test out how these pieces would interact in space. So this was at Boston University for a group show. And this was the first time this work was shown. And I fully think of this as a failure in that it was not ready. I should have committed to something else. But at the time, I think it was also important for that failure to occur. I think failure is something that continues to happen in my career, and that's very important. Especially when you're working with the space itself, sometimes things don't work out. And so I think that this is a very important experience in that work. And so from there, I really needed a palate cleanser, and I was asked to do a performance with the rugs, and I had made a video and was reading foot erotica that goes with the work. With every work, there's always writing that goes along with it. It's usually a lesbian foot erotica that accompanies. And so it's a great way, I think, to activate the work, as well as like it talks about what the research is about with everyone. So this was a great time to engage and also continue to use the work in different capacities. I'm not married to the idea of how these objects can exist. I think it's important for them to continue to change and to move and to be in these different capacities. I think it's something that is also like inherently important about textiles. They're very plastic, they're movable, they're shapeable. And so there's ways that they can exist as the same works, but in completely different configurations. So as you can see, these are works from my the solo show, If I Could, that then became these different works that were off the wall coming onto the floor. And so this work is finally, I feel like, when this came into existence. And so this was the work that had been started at the Museum of Arts and Design, and I finally finished it in time for this group show. And so this work was called To Teach or to Assume Authority. And so going back to this idea of ruins, I wanted to think about these spaces that I create, these installations, are occupying this imagined sense of time. And so how it can reference this pastness, but also exist accessing this futurity. And so I wanted to create these ruins that existed solely with textiles. And so these ruins are based off of these formations that are in southern Peru, Cacahuachi. And there it's a ceremonial complex that there buried was one of the largest pieces of hand-woven cloth that is thought to be in existence. It was like 60 meters long, very, very long. And to the point that archaeologists did not know how this was constructed, but it speaks to this community of women working together to achieve a singular goal. And in contrast, and thinking about these also as altars, as altar cloths, and thinking about that as the heart of the church, and how it's a traditionally female adorned space, but a traditionally male space, and thinking about these two linear histories and how they interact and mingle with these pieces. And so To Teach or to Assume Authority, it comes from biblical text that talks about that women in the church should not teach or to assume authority. I'm thinking about at that time, churches were the educational systems. And so thinking about how that was not a space that was conducive for everyone to learn, but then thinking about that with a very sort of feminine tradition of these pieces. So from there, I think of it as like this sketch. I became really interested in stripes. I feel like they're really incredible. They're a very dynamic cloth. But this was my first sort of experimentation with them that turned into this show. This was at a gallery in Brooklyn in 2019. And so after the ruin piece, To Teach or to Assume Authority, I really was like, I'm never doing a shag rug ever again. I need some distance. That's not who I am. And so I really went for it with this. It's hand-woven cloth and tufted cloth and ceramics. And so with stripes, there's this really incredible history that exists with them, in that there's biblical text that talks about how one should not wear a cloth that's made of two. And from that lineage, we actually get in the medieval period, people who were on the fringe of society were made to wear stripes if they were poor people, jesters, prostitutes. And from that lineage, we actually get the jail stripe, as well as the American flag. And so I wanted to think about this as this forbidden textile and how it can really speak to the forbidden, or exalt the sort of outcast or the outlier. So the work was adorning the space in stripes, and then everything itself was also striped. So I wanted to create this idea of like a labyrinth, people were not allowed to touch this work, again, in thinking about trying to contrast where I had been. And so I was trying to think of how the work could be activated without physical touch. And so labyrinths are something that are commonly used to think of as walking meditations, and how directing people through the space could be a way to also articulate how the viewer consumes the work. And so I wanted to think about these tufted pieces that were figurative, and how they could be stained glass windows in this space, and how, rather than depicting these very quaint narratives, it's what does that look like if there's something darker. And the faces themselves they're inspired from this civilization that was in Peru. I visited this museum on the northern coast called Lambayeque. And there he's called the Lord of Sipan. It's this incredible museum, but basically he was the King Tut of South America. And so there were a lot of really incredible metallurgy and ceramics of these figures. So I wanted to take these as symbols of sort of these anti-gender figures from an anti-hero society, and how they can exist on these pieces. And then these ceramics are meant to reference the previous coiled works that I had done, which coiling is also a ceramic technique, and how they could activate these rugs into being prayer rugs. Oh, and the show is called Of This World, rather. And so that comes from biblical texts talking about Paul. The Apostle Paul is saying that one should not be lost in pleasures of this world, but rather in the heavenly. And so from there, I did make more shag work, of course. So I went back to these ruins, and rather than being an idiot, honestly, I started making them to be catered to the pieces themselves. I don't know why it took me so long to figure that out. But the previous work was just all these different pieces that would lay together and basically be layered. And suddenly making them to be more tailored was much easier. And so this work was in the center of the space. This was on Governor's Island. And so I wanted the viewer basically to encircle the work. And so thinking about how color could be a way to make people move around the space, and how it could also be this very controlled exploration in color, and how color can speak to what the work is about. And so from there, this was at Performance Space in 2019. And so I had really wanted to do an installation that was really with this idea of like collective delusion, and thinking about these things, these hidden histories that are always surrounding us. And so initially I was trying to think, what are the ugliest colors that I could think of? And of course, Christmas. I feel like it's such a important and archetypal relationship of colors. And so I naturally gravitated toward that, but I was also thinking, what does that come from? And so, of course, red and green were used in medieval churches to delineate power structures between the clergy and the worshipers. And Christmas, the language of Christmas was really all over the place, until this very specific 1930s Coca-Cola ad that established this red as Santa, which is obviously the same red as Coca-Cola. And that really established this idea of this very specific language of Christmas. And so in thinking about something that is so accepted and widely seen as almost sacred, can really be something that, of course, gets tied back to consumerism and commercialism. And so I wanted the space to be very divided, and this was the first time I used paint to think about these pieces. And so since this was a performance space, this was a place where people could sit on these structures. They were full of sand, so they wouldn't fall over. People were always sitting on them and activating them. There were community meetings that happened. There were performances that happened, a lesbian Halloween party. this was a very, very active space. And that's something that I really love. I love this idea of being able to create these spaces for communal engagement and then it becoming its own being and out of my hands and able to create a lot of different scenarios. And so though while I was making it, I was convinced it was going to be this horrible like Christmas nightmare. But it actually ended up being almost like the Garden of Eden in this way and like looking very natural. And there were tufted works, obviously, again, to think about stained glass windows and using stripes and the divisions of color. So from there, this is now the beginning of 2020. I was invited to do my first solo show at a museum in Lima, which was always a dream of mine. And so I was so excited. 2020 was really our year. And I was really excited, obviously, coming off that show, really by using paint for the first time. It felt like this unlocking of new dimensions with the work. And so I wanted to basically create this like pile of rocks that existed in a space that were hand-woven cloth and tufted pieces, as well as the shag, and really thinking about the Battle of Jericho and how to create basically this like landscape of rocks and that encircling that like led to destruction. But there's also these rocks that are in southern Peru. They're called Sacsayhuaman, and they're thought to be these magic rocks, and that some of them are so large, they're like as big as buildings, that no one knows how they were moved into place. And they also fit together like very perfectly. And when the Spaniards came to harvest these rocks to build cathedrals, they couldn't be destroyed. And so they're like these really incredible, beautiful rocks. And so I wanted to make these an homage to that. But the pandemic happened. And so literally I was stuck in Peru, and there things became very intense. Like suddenly the borders were closed. Every single store was closed. There were no private cars that were allowed on the street. And there were curfews. It was a very intense way to enter the pandemic. And suddenly I found myself with so much time, but I literally was out of materials. So I basically just had to leave this work there. This was where I was living, my house that the museum had gotten for me. And so I just had to finally leave on an embassy flight back to the United States and just leave this work there. So it did get installed eventually, I think 6 months later, but this is another failure, obviously. But I think it was also an important thing to have happened. And I initially was really frustrated with this work. I hated that it was going to be tied to this time and that there was nothing that I could do about it. So it just felt like this horrible thing that I just did not want to deal with at all. I just wanted it to be thrown away, honestly. But when I came back to the United States, I really had to take some time from working. It just felt so frivolous to be an artist. When I came back to New York, it was when, 1,000 people were dying every day. It was quiet. All you could hear was sirens. It was very intense. And so for me, a way to ground myself, again, I got back to weaving. And so I really was just weaving, whatever color I could find, and really making just a ton of this striped cloth. And so I had wanted to make these sort of, again, going back to this idea of these arpilleras and these quilted pieces that's just the sewn cloth, sewn and stuffed. And so I was really interested in this idea of the work being far away from people. I felt like for things to be safe, there needed to be a lot of distance. And so these are literally called gargoyles. And so rather than focusing on the interior of churches, as I had been prior to the pandemic, I moved to the exterior as I feel like our worlds became increasingly more and more safe on the outside. So when thinking about gargoyles, obviously they're the throat of the building, and they're there to represent these like evil spirits and these demons that exist on the corners of cathedrals. They're far from people. But what I loved about them was that they represented the uncontrollable and change. And that felt like clinging to that idea felt like a safe way to navigate the uncontrollable and change. And so there are also these heads that are shaped as trophy heads, again, going back to these pre-Columbian figures, and again, going back to these striped sort of figures. And so this was at Brick for this incredible show that was called Latinx Abstract. And so thankfully, I was able to create these works for that show. And then from there, I was asked to revisit the work that was still in Peru. And this gallery, Crisis, was really incredible. And they wanted to put together the show, but with new works. And so revisiting not what the show could be or what it was, but what it could be. And so I'm always thinking about time. And so I was excited in literally working with myself in the past. And so revisiting these stripes and how to use these colors again that I had originally been working with for the museum. It felt like a really important way to really tie it all together. So working with these gargoyles again and how they can relate to sort of these like landscapes. And also at the time, it was a very tumultuous time in Peru. There was an impeachment that had occurred, and it was a very tumultuous setting. And so I really wanted it to be this like fantasy and an escape in this way. And very much in the canon of the writer Jose Esteban Munoz. He was this incredible writer that wrote about Latinx and queerness. And something that I'm always thinking about is how, as queer people, it's our job to really move beyond the time now and think about this futurity and keep pushing how we can push time forward. And so really, I think about these landscapes as being this push to like move forward in time, physically and literally. And so then I was really cemented with these new gargoyle pieces, and bless you. How they could also be, so it's two separate panels with hand-woven cloth, and so how they can also be shown in a multitude of different ways. And so this was a test that I had done. I like to think of physical objects as being these sketches, and how also these different weaving patterns can be stripes in themselves. And that thinking about, again, how it's an abstraction of the foreground and the background and not knowing which is which. So from there, I really was interested in working with ugly colors again, which I felt like neutrals were very difficult for me. I felt like they were too much of decor. And so I wanted to really go back to them and think about how they could be a part of a new installation. And so these works were the beginnings of what is at the Kohler right now. I believe it closes in January. But so they really asked, you know, what is your fantasy? Like, how do you want to take over this space? And so it's an incredible institution, and they also have part of Lenore Tani's studio and some of her work. She was an incredible fiber artist in the 60s, 70s, and beyond. And so they had shown a retrospective of hers where she has this incredible work that's called Clouds, and it's threads that are coming down from the ceiling. So I knew that I wanted to do an homage to her and have work that was suspended from the ceiling. So half of the work was going to be these neutrals that really were really centered around black and white and that obvious polarization that exists between them. This was the first sort of like test to see how the gargoyles were with the ruins and if it worked. And so then we moved forward with the museum, and this was the first sort of mock-up that existed of the space, which was very exciting to work in SketchUp for the first time. And so from there, I really, it all sort of fell into place. And so this work is called The Resilience of Things Not Seen. And so again, going back to things that I did not want to do, this work is very much about fear and revelation and that sort of like ominous feeling that exists within that. And it's interesting when you're in the space, actually, the pieces that are suspended from the ceiling, you kind of forget they're there. There is this like strange, ethereal, omniscient strangeness that exists with them. And so I wanted the viewer again to be a part of this work and this in-between space that exists, like literally the viewer is in between these pieces. And so the colors, the red and the purples, those come from Revelation. There's a lot of symbolism that exists within Revelation. But in reading about it more, it's interesting in that it's written by someone who is not an apostle. It's a part of apocalyptic literature. It's very specific, which actually apocalyptic literature at the time was something that was much more common and divisive and part of a community that was like very specific. So I really was interested in sort of facing my fear and going after this book and thinking about how these colors that are mentioned to be these sort of polarity that exists within these, how they can be manifested in these sort of pieces. So it resulted in this like very intense space. Obviously, I think intensity is something that I find very powerful, but at the same time, it's also very calming in this strange way. It's like it's gone too far to one end that it becomes something else. And with these gargoyles, initially, like they were meant to be on the corner because it's like a way to exist in two places at once. I think the in-between and opposites is something that is always coming up and how I'm interested in thinking about not only how that relates to my identity, but how it can exist in larger societal constructs. And also why I continue going back to the Bible and finding these like strange parts of it. I feel like it's like a way to give myself power in this way of highlighting these like very strange and specific parts of it. So these are the sketches for the show that's currently up at Deli Gallery. It's in Tribeca on White Street. So I needed to take a break from painting spaces. I felt like it was a way to be lazy and that it was a way to just like fill up space and how to continue to be much more intentional about the forms that exist. And so I wanted to make these columns and these ladders and thinking about this idea of heaven and earth and these like very not strange, but very structural figures and how they can exist with these textiles. And so this is what's up right now. And so they really are, they have this illusion of being structural as part of the building, but they also don't reach the top. So it's like this funny sort of joke almost where you feel like it's just, I'm just covering up something in the space. But this show, again, very much about heaven and earth and thinking about Jacob's Ladder. Jacob's Ladder is a story that exists within Islam, within Judaism and Christianity, but it changes depending upon obviously what it speaks to, but it really speaks about heaven and earth. And so I wanted there to be these pieces that have almost this lightness with this like heaviness and density that exists within these columns and how they can be covered in these textiles. And it's the softness that is around something so brutal. And at the top of these ladders are videos of my feet. It's like a foot erotica, and then there's also an element of me reading my foot erotica as well. So it felt like a way to really revisit a lot of ideas that I had in the past and how everything can continue to inform one another in these spaces, and how these heads can also reference the gargoyles, but be something different. And they're really just, again, there's sad faces and happy faces and that polarity that can exist within these pieces. And yeah, so I think that is it. Thank you so much. Right. Yeah, thank you.
Back one of the front so that
That's good. How do you really maybe stop them, like really happen? Because I have to do stop structures and that it's a problem like doing the face or like make things stick.
Yeah, I think that was definitely a problem that I encountered definitely early on. And I think the way that I've always tried to approach it is how the technique can articulate the work rather than the work be articulated in the technique. And so it really was just, how can I do this as simply as possible? And that's why plywood just made the most sense of how that was something that I could do, or I had friends that could very easily do. But absolutely, I think it's important to think about, for me at least, like what exactly I want the end result to be, and then the simplest way to achieve that. I think that's also why like everything is just very simple rectangles, and that's just because that's what I know how to do. And things are becoming more complicated, but it's always just been a progression. And so I think that's can be important, as well as like how to keep things within what you're able to do.
Thanks for the presentation. It's very wonderful. And you work, you do really know how to talk well about your art. So I think that's inspiring too.
Thank you.
I just have a question about one of your recurring images of the face. I'm not sure if I missed it, but what was that informed by? Inspired the use of the face?
Yeah, it's inspired by pre-Columbian figuration, as well as like the idea of the stained glass window. I think the stained glass window was like a way to really think about how we're a very simple way to think about architecture and figuration, and like that sort of like subliminal ideas that can exist within that. And what does that look like if it represents something else that's in the Bible, rather than these like very quaint narratives? So the face has become, I think, a way also to also articulate the stripe and that strangeness that exists within the striped cloth, as well as a way to like, I feel like, lead the viewer to also understand a little bit more about the work. I love abstraction, but I also love figuration. And I think that it's important for me to vacillate between the two, and how there can be a symbiosis between them.
So like a stained glass window, I'm seeing it as like classically where we would put images of people on the window.
Yeah.
But also the idea of looking through a window. So there's something a little bit kind of voyeuristic about it.
Exactly. Definitely.
Like art.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I love for the work to be like engaged with. Obviously, I think since the pandemic, I don't think people will be able to touch it ever again, but I always want there to be a way where people can feel like they're able to exist with it. And I think that's why video honestly has become apparent again, because it's like a way for it to be satisfying to see that touch rather than physically touching.
If you have like in the United States, do you see your work expanding and getting larger, or do you feel like you found?
I feel like it's only going to get bigger, but I make like stupid rules for myself. So sometimes like I need distance from things, but then go back. I love taking up as much space as possible. I feel like, especially with textiles, it's seen as such, or in the past, it has been seen as like such women's work and so diminutive. And so for me, I think it's important to take up as much space as possible.
It's evident by the way you speak about your work that language is, well, that you're comfortable with language, and that it's something that, well, it seems to come naturally in a way. And you mentioned your writing within this genre of like you sort of like to admit I'm not so familiar with it. I was just
That's okay.
Googling, it's trying to find a few things, but I can imagine it is a bit of a popular concept that is mostly written and published within communities and not so much, I think you find it, Barnes and Noble or whatever. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your writing as it relates to visual practice. Curious what you would not share it in your presentation tonight, and just I was wondering if you could speak to that some.
Yeah, absolutely. I think writing actually preceded a lot of this visual work that I was making. I think honestly, because after I got out of school, I was just so broke, and writing was a way to really access levels of fantasy that I could not physically achieve. And so it was a way for me really to be as exploratory and as crazy as possible. And then from there, it really led me to feed and researching rugs. And they're actually this incredible symbol of colonialism, and that textiles weren't used on the ground in Peru prior to the Spanish coming. It was really after colonialization that happened, but they're seen as this very ubiquitous object from this part of the world. And so I think writing was just a way to connect the dots for me. And language I find to be very exciting in this way, but also my father is like a polyglot and can speak 5 languages. And he was kind of like, you need to at least speak English well, So I think that was very helpful. But yeah, I think I could have brought writing. I guess I should have, but I did give an artist talk. It was probably like my first one. I was not ready for it. It was at the Textile Museum of Canada, and I was talking at Sheila Hicks's show, and she was not there. But I read some of my writing, and the museum was so freaked out. They were like, what are you doing? We didn't know you were going to read this. And I guess I haven't read since then, but obviously things are very different. It was just such a funny experience, but I'm like really glad that I did it, because I think that it's important. Like, I think my work is like very beautiful, but it's not just beauty. I think I like to think about beauty as being an access point, but I never want it to be the only takeaway.
For what it's worth, I wasn't suggesting that you should or shouldn't.
Yeah.
And see why you might think, oh, it's not safe for work, or maybe I don't want it to be a consultation.
Definitely.
It's interesting to me that you have this parallel practice that you allow to be present with the work in the museum.
Definitely. And I think this show has been really helpful. Like, I'm really excited to work with more video and work with more audio. It feels like a way again to like engage in new ways that I'm very excited about.
Follow-up question. Are you an example of why an artist doesn't need an MFA?
I mean, talking to a master's program, I think it's different for everyone. I think, the way I went to a school that was a very great education, a fine public Texas university education. And I think for me, coming to New York, it was a really transformative experience. And there's so many ways to get alternative means of education here. And so that's really what I've been seeking out. But at the same time, like, I was not good in school. Like, I truly, up until college, like I scraped by. Honestly, I don't know what it was. I just could not. I didn't think I was smart. I hated reading, but I just had this like very conventional understanding of history, of literature, of everything, really until I moved here. And so I think I was so voracious and like going to free lectures and like trying to like do everything and anything possible. I feel like that was like a really incredible education in itself. But I think largely what I find, I've spoken to many master's students, and many friends of mine have their graduate degree, many do not. I think ultimately, what advice I have been given, it's like, it's your movie. And like, you always need to remember like what you want to do. And I feel like if you have a clear trajectory of what you want, you can build your own options in making that happen.
I love the answer, and for everybody in the room, by no means suggesting that you're wasting your time or other. But it shows that you can continue your education independently. You know, after you've been here, and you know, the world is your classroom if you want to.
Definitely. Absolutely. Mhm.
I love your work and also I love your presentation. And I saw your show.
Oh,
Yeah.
So good to see you.
And I just find it really amazing to see artists who creates like such immersive type of fiber work.
Mhm.
And especially in New York, you know, I don't know how to do it. Just like, and also like just from listening to you that all the work that you do is kind of in like a very short period between like when you have solo. How do you have house or like how do you create such like big massive amount of work in a short time?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is important, but I think it's also perhaps, you know, revisionist. I mean, I've been here for 11 years and really it took quite a few years before anything was happening. And I think now everyone says that, but it's like relish in that time because you can experiment, but it's very true. I think it's important to really try new things and to make mistakes and to like make victories in this way, but also how it can make sense for you. Everything was done in stages, like fully. When I moved here, I had a twin size bed because I wanted to work out of my apartment and space was much more important. Then that led to like a teeny studio for $200 a month. Then that led to like a bigger one at $400. And so everything was very gradual and all the while still working. And so I think it's always important to think about how to set up your life in the way that you want it to go. Like there's always a job, there's so much, there's every option here, which I think sometimes can be daunting and that you can get caught up in a job that you never wanted to do. And so it's important to really think about the long game rather than the short arcs of like what's happening like on Instagram, you know? So it's definitely been a learning experience and also grants. Again, like my first solo show at Deli Gallery, that was made possible from a grant from the National Latino Organization. And that enabled me to take 2 months off my job and just truly work 7 days a week for 10 hours a day, which is psycho, and I would never do that again. And so it's also like, I think it's all about how to like be patient with yourself, but also rest. And like, you know, I think that's important to think about the long game. That's what I just kept saying to myself is like, I want a long career, not a fast career.
I think weaving is one of the features of weaving is repetition, as in weaving, very labor intense. So I'm every day working some domestic work, including some textile and some cooking, and it also repeat and repetition every day. So when I approach my case, I'm finding some meditation from some repeat meditation, for example, reading. So and it's Corona period. I quite enjoyed some reading, like some textile and then paper. And I pursue some meditation from that. Sometimes boring and sometimes sheer. And I also learn. I may miss because I'm not perfect in English, but I find some you want to keep feeling from some fear and some original guilty, original esteem.
Yeah, guilt, definitely. Absolutely.
You have that kind of feeling when you make some reading.
Yeah, I think definitely my work has been a way to digest what has happened and what continues to be my life, for sure. I think It can be very meditative, and it often is, but it often can be a spiral where you have to be in control of your mind. Otherwise, you're going over bad memories or crazy things. So it can be both, but that's also what's so great about repetition, is that there's space for it to be peaceful. There's space for it to be, a spiral.
Why do you think some craft is intended as a look down from the final?
Yeah, I think it's the accessibility of it. I think sometimes because it's a hobby, and if it's a hobby, it's not serious. But I think for me, like, I love the accessibility. I think accessibility is like very important. Art, culture is for everyone. And I hate this idea that culture is for the elite. And so that's also why I love textiles, in that it's a very approachable material that literally everyone has a relationship to. And so it's an easy way to really access everyone and for them to see what's possible.
We have a question about
Yeah, great question. So everything is made in pieces. And in the past, I was having to store everything. Thankfully, now my gallery does it. Very thankful, but yeah, they also maintain the archive. But at the beginning of my career, the artist that I was initially working for, they taught me to like make a spreadsheet and like inventory. And that was actually really helpful, of like the dimensions and just like having all of that information stored in one place. And thankfully textiles are easy to store for sure. But I think having an archive for yourself is actually really helpful, because like you can see everything that's done. And when you get emails about it, you just can put all that info right in there.
You still use a spreadsheet?
I do not. I think the last time it was updated was like 2016. So so I was good about it for a little while, but which is, you just have to get started.
I liked this thing you said about, you're talking about the gargoyles and them being in two different places at once.
Mhm.
And one has sort of symbiosis between contradicting sort of ideas, and you talk about humility and excess, and what I'm interested in is like the extreme contrast between lesbian erotica and the Bible. So I'm just sort of interested in like how you relate to your religious, like how you have been able to arrive to where you are now without that education.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to have like a sliding doors moment of like what my life would have been like without that. But at the same time, I'm thankful for it. I've gotten to a place where I am very thankful for it. It's also, not special. I think a lot of people have had to grow up with a lot of religion. And so I think there is a relatability that exists within that. And yeah, I think the Bible is something that continues to be weaponized by the conservative right. And so why can't I also use it for lesbian foot erotica? I think that's also, I think it's a beautiful text, and it's something that I feel it's silly, I know, but it makes me feel like safer to know more about it, because I think it's easy to criticize it if you don't know about it. It just seems crazy. Why would anyone be religious? But when you are a part of that life and you know what it's like it's of course much more nuanced. Everything is much more nuanced. So it's a way to, rather than just throw away what my life was at the beginning, it's a way to reappropriate it and use it for good and not evil.
that's
So like on like an introduction to like the art world,
I'm really interested in like how the conversation relates to like someone who's interested in your work. If it's more like in the sexuality or the religion or the actual like physical like textile itself, and like what percentages do you think that like they consider that like they're looking at more majority of the time in that, because you're very successful.
I guess, well, thank you. I guess clarify your question a little bit more.
Yeah, like everything that you've been able to do. I was gonna ask the director, like how much do these speakers make giving these speeches?
Yeah.
Like that would be like my questions, like from everything that you provided today. Like I kind of have my own idea of like what percentage there is, but like I think what you would think is important in like relaying an opportunity like this to be stored, and like what you thought was like most crucial for the director or like the person who gave you the position to speak today, like not solve was like integral, like important to each.
Are you asking like why you think we invited her to do this?
Yeah, 100%.
I have no idea. I didn't invite myself, so maybe this isn't a question for me.
It might be a one, it's a number like that.
It's fine if you want.
I mean, honestly, I think maybe y'all could say it because I don't remember, honestly.
That's great. Well, maybe like talk about another way to look at that is what is something that maybe you get from coming to do a lecture like this, or like
Is that where you're asking, like, what I get out of aside from money?
asking about money?
Why do you think? What are the things about your work that are appealing to curators and others for giving you opportunities? Like, is
I
the
see.
elements that are really working for you from your perspective in the marketplace of opportunities?
I see, okay.
Is that right?
Is that,
That was very well.
okay. I mean, fair question. I wish I had like a really good answer, but I don't know. I really think, I guess allegedly like textiles are like, people like them right now, but at the same time, like I've always been working in textiles, so it's tricky. I think it's rather than thinking like what, like trying to see what's hot is, I have found it's about being like authentic to your perspective. No one else is making the work that you're making. And how can you make the best work possible? And I feel like when you're making the best work that you can make, it's the most intelligent, it's the most creative, etc. I feel like that's when, you know, people are attracted to that. People are attracted to authenticity and to confidence and like that, like engagement that can exist.
That's a great answer.
Was there
Did
any
it-
more questions or comments from anybody? Maybe it's time for one more.
Yeah, I'll kind of like go, I'll take it back up, what has it been, or what has your experience been when you include, Hebrew Bible or Christian Bible theology?
Like honestly, it's mostly been positive. I mean, it's just been positive. I think again, it is kind of like public domain at this point, and I think there hasn't really been anyone who's been like, how dare you? But I think it's very abstract interpretations of it. And it's like, even the striped cloth, I think a lot of people would have no idea that those verses exist in the Bible. So yeah, it's just been, if anything, it's been, I think people have been like, wow, this feels so good. I used to be da 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 da.
Can I coattail
That a little bit. Funny enough, I'm actually curious if you were considering the work religious.
No, definitely.
It is purely critical.
Yeah, I think it's definitely critical, but I think it's not religious because I think there's so much that's happened because of religion. And I think if anything, I keep using it again, it speaks to my experience, but it also speaks to issues of colonialism. That's another thing that occurred because of Christianity. Even Christopher Columbus referenced the Book of Revelation to fund his voyage to the United States.
To get his grant.
Yeah, to get his grant. So it's yeah, it's just about criticality. Okay. Thank you.